The year 1944 marked a devastating turning point for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japan's once dominant carrier air groups were decimated by the relentless American island-hopping campaign. The legendary pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor were largely gone, replaced by poorly trained and inexperienced youths. Their fleet carriers, the backbone of any modern navy, lay sunk beneath the waves following crucial battles like Midway and the Philippine Sea. Facing an inevitable, overwhelming invasion of their home islands, Japan resorted to a final, desperate military strategy. This new tactic was born from a chilling yet simple calculus: one pilot, one plane, one bomb, aimed at the heart of the American fleet. They called them Tokubetsu Kogekitai, or Special Attack Units, but the world would forever know them as kamikazes. The name itself evoked a spiritual desperation, meaning divine wind, a reference to the typhoons that had saved Japan from a Mongol invasion centuries earlier. Japanese commanders genuinely believed that these suicide attacks, which sacrificed pilot and machine for certain impact, were the only way to halt the industrial might of the United States. They hypothesized that the psychological shock and material damage inflicted by direct, uninterceptable hits would break the American will to fight and force a negotiated peace. The targets were the vital ships of the Allied fleet, primarily the huge aircraft carriers that projected American power across the Pacific. These carriers were the mobile airfields of the U.S. Navy, and their destruction was seen as the single most crippling blow Japan could deliver. This was not a strategy of maneuver or superior tactics, it was a desperate, almost mystical gamble on pure, self-sacrificial terror. The attacks were launched in waves, hoping to saturate the American defenses and ensure multiple critical hits on the most valuable capital ships. It was an unprecedented form of warfare, one that fundamentally changed the nature of naval combat in the last years of the war. The pilots were often fueled by propaganda and a deeply ingrained cultural concept of honorable death, seeing their sacrifice as the ultimate service to the emperor and the nation. The American Pacific Fleet, officially designated as Task Force 58 or Task Force 38 depending on the commander, was the most powerful naval force ever assembled. It was an immense, self-sustaining mobile city of steel, fire, and air power, operating thousands of miles from the nearest American port. This juggernaut consisted of dozens of aircraft carriers, both massive fleet carriers and smaller escort carriers, protected by a dense screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The sheer volume of aircraft that could be launched from these decks dwarfed anything the Japanese could field by late 1944. These ships represented the terrifying efficiency of American industrial mobilization, a seemingly endless supply of resources and manpower. The mission of this fleet was to systematically dismantle Japan's remaining hold on the Pacific Islands and prepare the ground for a final invasion. By the time the kamikazes appeared, the U.S. Navy had achieved undeniable command of the sea and air in virtually every theater. American pilots were overwhelmingly superior in training, experience, and the quality of their aircraft, easily dispatching conventional Japanese air attacks. This absolute air superiority made the concept of a suicide attack particularly jarring and terrifying to the American sailors. The standard defensive doctrine of the U.S. Navy was built around layers of protection, long-range radar, outer combat air patrols, and finally the inner ring of anti-aircraft fire from the ships themselves. Kamikazes were a terrifying anomaly that broke all the conventional rules of aerial warfare and defense. They flew with a single, suicidal purpose that made evasive maneuvers or gunnery skill irrelevant, focusing only on hitting the target. An experienced pilot attempting to bomb or torpedo a ship might be shot down, but a kamikaze pilot, by definition, would only be stopped by destruction or impact. The damage inflicted by a bomb-laden plane diving at over 300 miles per hour was often catastrophic, frequently penetrating deep into a ship's structure. The American fleet was strong, but its sheer size and value made it an irresistible and tempting target for this desperate new form of attack. The stage was set for a clash between overwhelming material force and fanatical, suicidal human will, creating a truly brutal chapter in naval history. The initial development of the kamikaze strategy was shrouded in intense military secrecy and ideological fervor. It was formally proposed and implemented by Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi in the Philippines during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Onishi recognized that conventional aerial tactics were no longer effective against the powerful American fleet and sought a radical alternative. He believed that the spiritual purity of a pilot willing to die for the emperor would provide an ethical and military edge over the materially rich Americans. The very first official kamikaze unit, the Shikishima Unit, launched its attack on October 25, 1944, marking the beginning of this new era of terror. That day, the escort carrier USS St. Lo was struck by a kamikaze, leading to a massive explosion and the ship's rapid sinking, sending a powerful shockwave through the U.S. Navy. The Japanese quickly escalated the strategy, mobilizing aircraft ranging from dedicated trainers to frontline fighters, all modified to carry a significant bomb load. Pilots underwent a brief and intense training program, focused less on advanced flying and more on the final, irrevocable dive toward the enemy ship. They were given ceremonial send-offs, often including a final cup of sake and the Hachimaki headband, symbolizing their purity and commitment. The planes, often old and technologically inferior to American Hellcats and Corsairs, became guided missiles of horrifying efficiency. Each successful hit was hailed as a great moral victory in Japan, fueling the belief that this ultimate sacrifice would ultimately save the nation. However, the strategy was also immensely costly in terms of both planes and, more importantly, the irreplaceable young men who flew them. The American Navy struggled initially to comprehend and counter an enemy that intentionally turned its aircraft into a weapon without hope of return. The shock factor of the kamikaze became a weapon in its own right, forcing American sailors to constantly scan the skies for the silent, deadly shape of a diving plane. The early effectiveness of the attacks was undeniable, as the U.S. Navy suffered its first major losses to a desperate, unconventional opponent. This devastating new threat required a dramatic re-evaluation of American defensive tactics and the organization of the entire Pacific Fleet. The psychological impact of the kamikaze on American sailors was arguably as damaging as the physical destruction they wrought. In conventional combat, there was always the hope that an enemy pilot would break off his attack, miss his target, or be intercepted and shot down. The kamikaze eliminated all those hopes, replacing them with the cold certainty of an aircraft deliberately aiming for your exact position. The sudden, horrifying realization that the pilot's mission was only complete with his own death created an unprecedented level of fear and stress. Lookouts and radar operators faced a constant, crippling tension as they watched the blips of incoming planes that would not turn away. For the first time, American ships were facing an enemy weapon that could not be deterred by damage, only by absolute disintegration before impact. Even an aircraft that was shot to pieces and on fire would often continue its fatal trajectory straight onto the target's deck or superstructure. The anti-aircraft gunners, typically the last line of defense, found themselves in a terrifying life-or-death duel against a human projectile. Ships that had easily shrugged off conventional bomb or torpedo hits were now crippled by the force of a high-speed kamikaze strike. The fires, explosions, and high casualty rates of the successful attacks were brutal reminders of the enemy's fanatical resolve. Sailors witnessed their comrades vaporized or maimed by the strikes, leading to widespread combat fatigue and nervous exhaustion throughout the fleet. Rumors and exaggerations about the scale of the attacks often spread faster than official reports, magnifying the sense of vulnerability. The high-value carriers and battleships, once considered nearly invulnerable, were now seen as prime targets, increasing the anxiety on every major vessel. This psychological warfare was exactly what the Japanese leadership had hoped to achieve, attempting to demoralize the technologically superior American forces. The American Navy had to adapt quickly, not just with new tactics, but with psychological resilience to counter this terrifying, all-or-nothing approach to war. The Battle for Okinawa, code-named Operation Iceberg, represented the final, massive amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Okinawa was strategically crucial, lying only 340 miles from the Japanese home islands, making it the final stepping stone for the planned invasion. The sheer size of the invasion force was staggering, involving over 1,300 ships and more than 500,000 servicemen from the United States and the Allied nations. The battle lasted for 82 grueling days, becoming one of the most brutal and costly engagements of the entire war. For the Japanese, the defense of Okinawa was framed as the ultimate, decisive battle to save their homeland from subjugation. It was during this period, from April to June 1945, that the kamikaze attacks reached their absolute peak in intensity and scale. The Japanese Navy and Army launched 10 massive aerial operations, or kikusu, floating chrysanthemums, attacks, against the invasion fleet. These massive strikes involved hundreds of aircraft in a single wave, overwhelming the American defensive umbrella with sheer numbers. The intention was not merely to harass the fleet but to destroy it, sinking enough ships to force the Americans to withdraw or at least delay the invasion. The primary targets remained the aircraft carriers, but every ship providing support to the troops on the island was now fair game. The waters around Okinawa, known as Typhoon Alley, became the most dangerous stretch of ocean in the history of naval warfare. The kamikazes were flying from airfields on Kyushu and other Japanese islands, making their final, one-way trips to the battle zone. The American fleet was tasked with supporting the landing, providing fire support for the troops ashore, and maintaining a constant anti-air and anti-submarine screen. This sustained, relentless aerial siege forced the U.S. Navy to evolve its anti-kamikaze defenses rapidly and decisively. The sheer volume of enemy aircraft required a complete rethinking of fleet disposition and the distribution of defensive firepower. It became abundantly clear that the existing defensive doctrine was insufficient to handle 1,000 fanatical, suicidal attacks over the course of 3 months. The key tactical innovation that ultimately saved the main U.S. fleet was the establishment of the destroyer picket stations. Recognizing that the kamikazes were overwhelming the existing close-in defenses, the U.S. command decided to move the battle zone outward. This decision involved deploying a ring of approximately 16 radar picket stations in a semicircle around the main fleet anchorage off Okinawa. Each picket station was typically anchored by 1 or 2 destroyers, often supported by smaller craft and sometimes a larger radar picket ship. These destroyers, affectionately known as tin cans, were fast, heavily armed, but ultimately fragile ships never designed to fight alone. Their primary and terrifying mission was to serve as the fleet's sacrificial alarm system and outer layer defense. The destroyers were equipped with the most advanced radar technology available, allowing them to spot incoming enemy formations far earlier than the main fleet. By intercepting and reporting the kamikaze flights, the destroyers bought precious minutes for the carrier-based combat air patrols to scramble and intercept. Crucially, the picket destroyers were also meant to draw the fire of the kamikazes, diverting the attacks away from the invaluable aircraft carriers. They were positioned on the expected flight paths of the Japanese aircraft streaming south from the home islands, guaranteeing a fight. This tactic deliberately placed the smallest, most expendable ships directly into the path of the most devastating weapon the Japanese possessed. The sailors on these picket ships understood their role perfectly. They were the bait, the early warning, and the fleet's last chance before disaster. Life on the picket stations was a continuous nightmare of high alert, intense anxiety, and sudden, violent combat against overwhelming odds. The isolation of the picket line meant that, once engaged, the destroyers had to rely entirely on their own crew, guns, and resolve for survival. The picket concept was a testament to the flexibility and tactical genius of the U.S. Navy, transforming a vulnerability into a layered defense. These small ships, standing alone on the perimeter, became the true battleground where the kamikaze menace would be broken or succeed. The destroyer was a ship of paradoxes, small enough to be nimble, yet carrying enough anti-aircraft artillery to be a formidable defense platform. In the face of a kamikaze attack, the destroyer's small size suddenly became a terrifying liability, making them easier to hit but also easier to sink. A direct, high-speed strike from a kamikaze often meant the complete destruction or crippling of the Satinkan and its crew. When the radar on a picket ship illuminated dozens of incoming bogies, the crew immediately knew they were facing a kikusu wave. The ships would execute violent, high-speed turns, attempting to present the smallest target profile and bring the maximum number of guns to bear. The noise and chaos of a destroyer's anti-aircraft barrage were deafening, a frantic, continuous roar of 5-inch guns and 40mm boffers. Tracers filled the sky in desperate, beautiful arcs, attempting to create a defensive curtain of flak and shrapnel around the vulnerable vessel. The pilots of the kamikazes, often poorly trained and flying outdated aircraft, were magnetically drawn to the nearest target, which was usually the picket destroyer. The destroyers, while taking the brunt of the assault, successfully scattered the enemy formations, preventing them from coalescing into a single, overwhelming strike on the main fleet. Each destroyer that managed to survive an attack had a miraculous story of near misses, critical damage, and heroic damage control efforts. The crews fought with a ferocity born of desperation, knowing that a single lapse in their gunnery or vigilance could mean their immediate doom. The relentless nature of the attacks meant that a destroyer might fight off several waves of planes in a single day, pushing the men past the point of exhaustion. The speed and responsiveness of the smaller ships allowed them to evade the initial dive better than the larger carriers or battleships, giving them a slight edge. Yet, despite their best efforts, the losses were heavy, and the picket line quickly became a graveyard for dozens of American destroyers and their brave crews. The courage and sacrifice of the men on these ships turned the tide, buying the necessary time and space for the main fleet to prosecute the invasion. Picket Station 1, positioned at the northernmost and most exposed flank, became one of the most dangerous assignments in naval history. This station was the first and last point of contact for the largest and most frequent waves of kamikazes flying down from Kyushu. The sheer volume of air traffic made it a magnet for every desperate pilot determined to reach an American warship. The destroyers assigned to this station, such as the USS Laffey and the USS Aaron Ward, endured unimaginable, concentrated aerial bombardment. The Laffey earned the nickname the ship that would not die after surviving a legendary engagement on April 16, 1945. On that single day, the Laffey was attacked by at least 22 aircraft, ultimately being struck by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs. Her crew fought ferociously, managing to shoot down 9 enemy planes despite the chaos and catastrophic damage the ship sustained. The destruction was total and terrifying, with massive fires, the steering gear disabled, and her forward guns rendered useless. Yet, through sheer grit and magnificent damage control, the surviving crew kept the ship afloat and their remaining guns firing until the attack subsided. The USS Aaron Ward faced a similar, brutal reckoning, enduring multiple strikes that tore through her superstructure and killed numerous sailors. These ships became floating monuments to the sacrifice of the picket line, absorbing blows meant for the carriers behind them. The men on picket station 1 knew, with a certainty few other sailors experienced, that they were living on borrowed time with every rotation. Their constant, successful defense, even in defeat, chipped away at the kamikaze's psychological advantage over the American command. The ability of these small ships to endure and keep fighting under the most horrific circumstances demoralized the Japanese planners. The incredible ordeal of these vessels demonstrated that even the most fanatical weapon could be stopped by an equally determined defense. The bravery displayed at these exposed stations ensured that the core of the U.S. fleet could continue its primary mission relatively unscathed. The battle for the picket line was a story of almost unimaginable naval sacrifice, but it was also a triumph of American damage control and resilience. In total, the U.S. Navy lost 26 destroyers and smaller craft, with nearly 1,000 sailors killed or missing, making it one of the costliest operations for the fleet. More than 120 other ships were damaged, ranging from minor hits to near-total crippling by the high-velocity, bomb-laden aircraft. However, the destroyers did their job. Only 3 aircraft carriers were seriously damaged by kamikazes, and none were permanently put out of action during the Okinawa campaign. The fact that the most valuable capital ships survived is a direct testament to the effectiveness and sacrifice of the picket screen. When a ship was hit, the well-trained damage control teams immediately sprung into action, fighting fires, shoring up bulkheads, and tending to the wounded. The ability of American sailors to save their damaged ships, often under continuing attack, was a constant source of frustration for the Japanese. Many destroyers, mangled and barely floating, were towed back to rear bases, repaired, and sent back into the fray within weeks or months. The experience gained in fighting the kamikazes led to rapid, on-the-spot innovations in anti-aircraft tactics and defensive formations. Ships began to prioritize the 5-inch guns, which could use proximity-fused shells, creating a massive explosion near the incoming plane. The sheer volume of fire was increased, with every available crew member manning a gun or helping to supply ammunition to the firing stations. In the aftermath of the most vicious attacks, rescue ships and hospital crews would rush to the damaged stations, providing aid and ferrying the wounded back to safety. The survival stories from the picket line are replete with instances of individual heroism, from engine room crews refusing to abandon their post to medics working tirelessly on burning decks. This combination of tactical innovation, overwhelming firepower, and incredible human endurance ultimately tipped the scales. The kamikaze was a brutal weapon, but its effectiveness was fatally mitigated by the resilience and defensive structure of the American fleet. The existential threat of the kamikaze spurred a dramatic acceleration of technological and tactical innovation within the U.S. Navy. The use of radar picket ships was a rapid evolution of existing technology, immediately extending the fleet's defensive perimeter by dozens of miles. New, highly effective anti-aircraft rounds, particularly the proximity-fused shell, became the most important development in countering the suicide planes. The proximity fuse, a tiny radar inside the shell, detonated the projectile when it sensed the approaching aircraft, creating a cone of deadly shrapnel. This technology effectively turned a near miss into a kill, drastically improving the chances of destroying the kamikaze before it reached the ship. The Combat Information Center, or CIC, on every ship became the nerve center for anti-air defense, coordinating radar and gunnery from a central point. Operators tirelessly tracked hundreds of aircraft, communicating their speed, altitude, and trajectory to the gunnery crews with precision. The U.S. Navy also began to develop dedicated radar picket vessels, sometimes converting older destroyers or using specialized landing craft for the task. These ships were loaded with advanced radar equipment and additional anti-aircraft guns, specifically designed for the sole purpose of intercepting the attack waves. Tactical doctrine shifted to favor a split-fire strategy, where different gun mounts were assigned to separate incoming aircraft, preventing concentration on a single target. Carrier-based fighter planes, the true first line of defense, were directed by the picket ships to intercept the kamikazes far out to sea. The Big Blue Blanket, the constant presence of American fighter planes, decimated the kamikaze formations before they ever reached the inner perimeter. The Navy also began to incorporate psychological defenses, broadcasting messages to the pilots in Japanese, reminding them of the futility of their mission. These innovations, born out of desperate necessity, transformed American naval warfare, making the defensive screen exponentially more effective. The combination of technology and smart tactics ultimately rendered the kamikaze a costly, but strategically failing, weapon of desperation. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, the kamikaze strategy had failed to achieve its strategic objective of breaking the American fleet or its will to fight. While the attacks inflicted significant casualties and ship damage, the U.S. Navy maintained operational control of the seas around the island. No major American warship was permanently sunk, and the flow of supplies and troops to the beaches continued unabated throughout the campaign. The Japanese sacrificed thousands of pilots and aircraft that they could ill afford to lose, weakening their defenses for the eventual invasion of the home islands. The relentless pressure of the destroyer picket line had absorbed the worst of the blows, proving that a determined, led defense could withstand the fanaticism. The sheer attrition rate for the kamikazes became unsustainable, with American forces shooting down an ever-increasing percentage of incoming planes. Japanese commanders, while initially optimistic about the kamikaze's psychological power, watched their most dedicated pilots disappear without decisive strategic gain. The destroyers, the often forgotten heroes of the Pacific, were instrumental in this victory, turning the tide with their sacrifice and endurance. Their role as a shield allowed the massive carriers to launch their fighter planes and maintain the all-important air superiority over the battle space. The kamikaze, intended as the ultimate weapon, was ultimately reduced to a tactical nuisance that caused damage but could not change the war's outcome. The American fleet had faced down the greatest manifestation of suicidal military fervor in history and emerged bruised but fundamentally unbroken. This final, desperate gamble by Japan proved to be a failure, solidifying the American path toward total victory in the Pacific. The resilience shown by the sailors and the success of the defensive innovations permanently altered the course of naval history. The tide had not only turned, it had irrevocably swung in favor of the American industrial and tactical supremacy. The legacy of the destroyer picket stations at Okinawa is one of incredible bravery, self-sacrifice, and crucial strategic importance. The men who fought on the tin cans earned a reputation for unflinching courage in the face of the ultimate, one-way attack. Their service is often overshadowed by the larger battleships and carriers, but their role was absolutely indispensable to the successful conclusion of the war in the Pacific. Many of the damaged destroyers were repaired and went on to serve in the occupation of Japan and in the post-war American fleet. The lessons learned in anti-kamikaze defense immediately informed the design and doctrine of all future naval warships. The need for highly effective, close-in weapon systems and advanced radar would become permanent features of every major naval vessel. The kamikaze attacks remain a sobering example of the psychological and material damage that can be inflicted by fanatical, asymmetrical warfare. Historians today recognize that the destroyer picket line was one of the most effective defensive countermeasures developed by the U.S. Navy in the war. Veterans of the picket line, those who survived the constant terror, carried the scars of that unique and brutal combat for the rest of their lives. The sacrifice of the young Japanese pilots is remembered as a tragic chapter, a testament to the extremes of desperation in a losing cause. The story of the destroyers is a powerful reminder that the outcome of massive campaigns often rests on the actions of small, determined units. They were the shield that protected the heart of the American fleet, and their tenacity ensured that the divine wind could not fulfill its deadly prophecy. The monuments and preserved ships serve as a permanent tribute to the men who stood alone against the storm and held the line until the tide of the war completely turned.